In the last class, I attempted to convince you that because we have these unstable or, the ecosystem is always changing and humans are in there doing their human thing in various ways, which tends to be different than what we might expect. And that in that sense, whenever we do a human ecology study, it's not just going to be about the natural resources, it's going to involve some sort of political considerations, the politics and negotiations that humans do. I tried to convince you of that, and then Liv, you read like a sentence into our reading, and you're like, he just read ahead like one sentence. Were you convinced by this sentence? Yes, you were. It's a very convincing sentence because there I was. Yeah, I just tricked you by reading a few sentences ahead. Many anthropologists consider most human ecological studies to really be analyses of political ecology because the main determinants for how resources are accessed and distributed are political. There you go. All you had to do is get ahead a little bit in the reading. That's the professor trick. So they start off here. We're going to be examining in this class what that means. And sometimes people get down on politics. Oh, it's going to be a bad year, isn't it? 2024 politics. Boy, this is going to be terrible. But they don't mean politics in the narrow electoral sense. They mean it in kind of the negotiations and the organization of power in human life, more broadly speaking. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this class, is how the political aspects of ecological life for human beings. The first thing they talk about is the balance or the presence in every society of both cooperation and competition, and how there are certain places. They talk about if you have an irrigated field, for example, that has a high intrinsic value and a clearly bounded area, it's likely to be a place of competition or where people try to erect barriers and defend it and keep other people out. Whereas if you have kind of wide-ranging fields and they're not necessarily of high intrinsic value of themselves, then people might be more likely to cooperate rather than compete. The other crucial factor here is that, as we've talked about in the last class, human beings are always trading stuff around. And while over the years, some populations have been more internally sufficient than others, especially today, we're all interlinked together and we're going to be cooperating and competing for resources, not just within our own groups, but with other groups and for other kinds of things. Now, as we enter these next years of our lives, Simi, what is likely to happen with this cooperation and competition and the fact that we're not self-sufficient? What's gonna happen, or what do we think is going to happen out there as I try? Likely to be exacerbated or increased, or the effects of this as our climate changes, and we, probably are going to be everyone has to get food and resources from other places. Are those food and resources still going to be accessible? Are there going to be different things that happen to them that make them more inaccessible? I told my children that if they ever see that the price of Italian tomatoes is going up, to immediately notify me so I can buy all the canned tomatoes before anybody else does. So I'm ready, stockpiled anyway. The point is that some of these things prices or things might become scarce in different ways. And that's just probably going to be on the horizon. Liv went into the conclusion, the summary, for something that they didn't actually talk about in the chapter from Lawrence Slobodkin, suggests that 4 patterns of change underlie the dynamics of all environments. And I think that applies not just to, I think it works well with the idea of climate change as well. So he was talking about all environments, but I think it's good to think about in terms of what's going to happen, probably likely to happen with climate change. Changes in the novelty, frequency, magnitude, and duration of environmental events of all sorts. So I think that's what we're likely to see. I started thinking about this. So novelty, let's just go in order and see how we go. So with climate change, I used to think, we can handle a couple warmer degrees here. It's Oneonta, we're fine. I could use a little bit of, a little bit of warming is okay with me. We'll just get less snow and we'll be happier, warmer in the summer. But then, I don't know, were you here over the summer? Was anybody here over the summer when all of a sudden something novel happened that had hardly ever happened in Oneonta and really made me afraid what might happen? Happened down in New Jersey too. The smoke, all of a sudden something that was happening far away in a place called Canada comes drifting down here and like ruins our lives. Like can't go outside, can't go running, can't enjoy the fresh air because it's all smoggy and smoked up. That was definitely a novel event. And I hope it doesn't happen more often, but that's the frequency part, right? So we have novelty, and then we have the idea of frequencies. So new things that haven't happened in areas. Though those wildfires are quite common in Canada, but the fact that they were drifting down to here is kind of a novel thing. Frequency. So that's something like, for example, we can talk about, they measure for how many 90-degree days are you going to have? And in different places, that number is predicted to go up. So it's, it's not a novel event to have a 90-degree day. But if you're having, 15 of them as opposed to 10 of them, then that's more frequency and makes your life difficult. Magnitude. So in this case, we might be talking about temperatures that are unheard of. Places that rise to say 115 degrees, where it's never been that high before. So bigger than normal or smaller than normal, the magnitude. And then of course the duration. So what might have been a small dry period turns into a longer period, a drought of longer duration. So it is quite possible, and we are already seeing both novelties, things that are happening in places that didn't used to happen, like wildfire smoke. We're seeing greater frequency of events, greater magnitude, and longer durations. So we are definitely in a period, and perhaps have long been in one, of what is environmental uncertainty, novelty, all these things. Amanda, what do people do when they have environmental uncertainty? What's one thing we can do to deal with that? Or what's the one thing we do as people when things are uncertain?
Ignore it.
Yes, we do often ignore it. It's always good to ignore uncertainty. That is true too. But if we don't ignore it, what else do people do? What has long been a strategy of people doing things? You quoted this one. Another factor encouraging individuals and groups to maintain a multiplicity of political associations. They talk about all the Observers of social life in the Middle East have been struck by the great amount of time and energy individuals spend socializing and politicking. The ubiquitous tea houses of rural Turkey, the village guest houses, the coffee shops. So it could just be as simple as people talking to each other and, coming up with different ways to negotiate and making sure that you have a bunch of alliances and you're not burning all your bridges. They need to cooperate. Yeah, you have a multiplicity. So it's I mean, obviously this isn't always happening in the world and people are being mean to each other instead of politically associating, but it's one way of helping with this idea of environmental uncertainty. It's kind of like the opposite of ignoring it. You're talking about it and you're creating new strategies to deal with it. Another way in which our human ecology is also political ecology. And then in pretty much the rest of the chapter, they talk about various ways of how people access their resources. Pluto, you talked about this. What do we need to have if it were any group of human beings in terms of resources? What do we need?
The area you're in, like, can produce those resources, or at least has those resources.
You need some sort of assurance that you're going to have resources over time. And as they say on the next page, in every society has principles that govern who may use which resources and under what circumstances. So, we all need resources. We've been talking about food. That's a good one to talk about. We'll probably be talking about that for much of these first few weeks. Resources of food, having access to being able to produce, exchange, distribute, process that food. And in every society, there's going to be ideas about who can use this. It's always going to be a political negotiation and consideration. Now, in our own society, or there's one way in which people have access to resources, which is private ownership. Like us, US people, like Americans, Pluto, what do we think we can do with stuff? We can own everything. If I own it, I can do whatever I want. Land, water, minerals, machinery, and all types of productive resources as things that someone can own. And by own, I mean, if I have it, I can do what I want. Now, obviously, not really. There are limits to this. There are laws. I can't just do whatever I want, but, kind of. It's the idea that I can do things that with my own land. Is this true anywhere else, Liv? Does anybody else think like this?
Europeans?
They do. And where else? Did anybody else get introduced to this idea of private ownership?
Oh, yeah, where they call it.
Yeah, I mean, probably this is a popular idea, or not a popular idea. It's an idea that is in place now in almost every society. The idea that an individual or a corporation can own and do what they want with these resources. Now, this might be good, Amanda. Why? What does it let me do? Yeah, and we like something, we like freedom, right? We like the freedom to do things and innovate and, put our land or whatever it is to productive use or do whatever you want. We all like freedom. And, that can be a good thing. But, well, what does that do? Let's see. I don't know. Maybe assuming I'm asking a question that I don't know if you really answered, but what does that do to your idea of the group if you are only an individual owning things? Yes, I was asking that, but I just didn't know it. I forgot that I was. Yeah, I was thinking also about, I think you also mentioned that people lose their ties to the group or ties to group identity. But in this case, it is also true that if I have the freedom to own land and do what I want with the land and hire people to work on the land, we end up with this situation, which is rather, I don't want to say it's unique in human history, but it's kind of unusual. The idea that I own a piece of land and there's a bunch of people working on the land who don't own the land. And they have to do what I want because I'm paying them. And that's a pretty, if you think about it, it's kind of a bizarre idea. Not all, many societies would basically reject this idea. They would say the people that are working on the land and the people who are doing the work should be the ones who profit or who at least are able to subsist from those resources. But in our society and many societies around the world, we get this separation where the people that own this stuff, we talked about this in the last class, the people that own things might be far away. They might be in a whole different city or a whole different country, and they're kind of still controlling the destiny of the land and the place that people work on. Now, the idea of private ownership, of course, can be contrasted with the idea of some sort of group ownership. Now, this is also known as collective ownership, or they call it corporate ownership. Now, I want to be careful here because when they're using, we can use the term corporate in two different senses. In some cases, in the American sense of the term corporate, we're usually talking about corporations. But when they say corporate ownership, they just mean a larger group or a larger body. They're not talking about a corporation. So here we're talking about some sort of social ownership of the land in which the people who are using it, the people who are working on it, are also the ones who have ties to it. And so your ownership of the land or your right or the ownership of the resources are said to belong to the group. And it may be that you as an individual have specific rights and specific titles and specific ways that you could use the resources, but your rights come from your membership in that group. They do not come just, you can't just sell them. You can't simply transfer them off. They are not yours from all time. They depend on your ties to this group. And so we have different ways or contrasting ways of ideas about the ownership of resources and the ownership of land and what you should be able to do with it. Now, I want to from there go into a perhaps slightly more complicated idea, which they talk about toward the end of the chapter, of how gender, politics, and property intersect. Now, we've talked about how in Europe and in the United States, land, water, and other resources were said to be individually owned, that you could own them, you could inherit them, pass them along. But there's a somewhat interesting fact, which many people may not be aware of, is that in Europe, there were also people who were pretty much excluded from inheriting and owning such things. Simi, who were not able to be or severely restricted in much of Europe from owning land and other things. Women. Yeah. And so, in much of, not all, not all, but in much of European and American, US countries, for centuries, uh, you wouldn't be able to own property if you were a woman. And even if your husband passed away, you would not be able to, or you would not be able to inherit it or pass it along to your female heirs. It just wasn't a thing, only to men. Now, I want a side note here. They don't mention this, but it's just a little bit of a note, because again, a lot of people don't know this, is that in the Muslim world, women actually had inheritance and property rights long before most European women did. And so, I mean, it's again, I'm not saying everything was beautiful and nice there in terms of gender and gender equality, but it is curious, as many of us believe that, that or the stereotype is that people in the Islamic, the Muslim women do not have the same rights, but in terms of property rights and inheritance and how, and being able to participate in the economy, Muslim women had this long before European women did. Now, I say that this is in part more complicated because one of our last examples here is of the Nandi in Western Kenya. And what our anthropologist Regina Smith Obler is talking about here is that the word for ownership gets kind of translated differently. So we think about ownership when we say, oh, who owns these cows? They would say, well, the men own the cows. And, technically that may be true, but what she's saying is that it isn't the term, well, I'll read part of the problem is linguistic. The term own, like to own something, has many connotations among the Nandi. Several people can have rights in the same animal at the same time. So sometimes we get into this perhaps overly simplistic difference between, private ownership, group ownership, and those are important concepts, but in many societies, there's also these kinds of the idea of ownership rights, which are different than those we are most accustomed to. And so what she was saying is there's tension in this society because there are people who are trying to move ownership more over into the men and have more of what we might consider a Western idea or a European idea of male ownership. But there's still this traditional idea of having rights in an animal at the same time. So when we look at other societies and their ideas of ownership, we just have to be careful not to kind of too simplistically impose our own dichotomies or ideas about how people think about these resources. But in general, this chapter gives us, at least at the end, in this small section that we read for today, a sense of kind of more of the principles of human ecology, political ecology, how these things have to be studied and negotiated. Another example of people who think differently about ownership is back on page 53 with that exclamation point is, of course, a click sound, which I'm going to attempt to do, but I'm not a native speaker, of course. The Kung people of Southern Africa. What do the Kung say about owning land, Pluto? What would they say? You can't eat the ground. Doesn't matter who owns the land itself, because one cannot eat the ground. Perhaps an obvious point, But, they have a very different idea about, well, why would you even want to own the land? Now, again, that doesn't mean they don't have ideas about a territory, about the rights to grazing, about the rights to hunt and gather in certain areas. But this idea that you would have a limited, that you would have ownership and be able to transfer it from person to person was at first seen as rather absurd. Does not matter who owns the land itself, because one cannot eat the ground. And that is a great quote to go into our next full chapter. This chapter, oh, we're just cruising along here. Chapter 3 on foraging.